The galaxy was silent, but the silence did not bring peace. It was the kind of quiet that preceded a storm, the moment before thunder cracked across the sky. In the void of space, among the stars that had long outlived the empires they once bore witness to, a single transmission echoed through subspace. It was not a declaration of war. It was not a plea for mercy. It was a recording, a child's voice, crying, "The Galactic Empire, in all its centuries of dominance, had never feared anything quite so much as what followed. The conquest of Sol 3 had been swift, efficient, and entirely bloodless. The Empire had long since perfected its method of assimilation, target the governing bodies, disable key military installations, and offer surrender terms too enticing to refuse. They expected the humans to fall in line, as so many species before them had done. And at first, it seemed they had. The United Earth government had capitulated within hours, its leaders brought to kneel before the throne of the Emperor's High Council. Humanity's weapons, crude by galactic standards, had been confiscated or decommissioned. Their orbital defenses were stripped away. The great cities of Earth, from the glittering spires of Neo-Tokyo to the sprawling megacities of the American Federation, were placed under strict surveillance. To the imperial mind, it was a perfect conquest. No prolonged war, no unnecessary bloodshed. Humanity would be integrated, their culture catalogued and assimilated. Their species, with its stubborn individualism and aggressive tendencies, would be tamed. It had been done before, it would be done again. Except, something was wrong. The humans were silent. The Empire had conquered countless worlds, and in every case, there had been resistance. Even the most feeble species, those without claws or fangs, without fleets or weapons, had fought back in whatever way they could. There were always riots, insurgencies, desperate acts of defiance. But on Earth, there was nothing. No rebellions, no sabotage, no whispered resistance movements in the shadows. The humans just watched. They stared at their conquerors with something far worse than fear. They observed. They memoized. They learned. The Empire dismissed it as a sign of submission. Until the first incident. Commander Zalthur of the Imperial Security Division stood over the body with a sense of growing unease. The remains were barely recognizable, charred beyond comprehension. Not from plasma fire, not from kinetic weapons, from a simple, homemade incendiary device. A human child had detonated it. A child. Zalthur turned to his lieutenant, his mandibles clicking in irritation. "Explain this to me." The officer shifted uncomfortably, the exoskeletal plates of his uniform rattling. "It appears to be retaliation, sir. The unit stationed in Sector 17 conducted a pacification operation last night. A group of humans attempted to violate curfew. The guards enforced discipline." "Enforced discipline how?" The lieutenant hesitated. Zalthur narrowed his 6 eyes. "Speak." "The child's father was neutralized, as a warning to the others." "Silence." Zalthur exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to bare his fangs. "So they retaliated." The lieutenant nodded. "The child constructed an incendiary weapon, infiltrated a supply depot, and detonated it. 4 officers dead. 5 others wounded." He paused. "Including 2 civilians. Their own civilians." Zalthur felt the cold weight of unease coil in his stomach. This was wrong. This was not how subjugation worked. The conquered feared their rulers. They obeyed. They bent. They adapted. They did not sacrifice their own young in acts of defiance. How did the other humans react? Zalthur asked. The lieutenant shifted again. They applauded. A slow, dreadful understanding settled in Zalthur's mind. He turned his gaze towards the cityscape beyond the towering observation windows. The humans below moved about their daily lives with eerie calm. No panic, no visible distress. Just waiting, watching. And then, the transmission arrived. It was an audio file, routed through the Imperial Fleet's secure network. At first, it was dismissed as interference, a mere anomaly in the data stream. But then, the voices came through. The voice of a child, crying, the sound of something breaking, a struggle, and then a gunshot. Silence. A pause. And then, another sound. A growl. The audio cut out. But the message had been received. Within hours, Imperial officers across the city began reporting disappearances. Entire patrols vanishing without a trace. Communication lines went silent. Civilians stopped answering doors. The city, once obediently passive, began to turn. A week later, the bodies started appearing. Zalthar stood in the dimly lit war room, staring at the reports on his data slate. The words blurred together in his vision, but the meaning was unmistakable. Imperial forces were being hunted. Not in large-scale battles, not in open rebellion. This was something worse. Something personal. It was precise. Surgical. The Empire's own tactics turned against them. The officers who had ordered the execution of the child were the first to die. Their bodies were found gutted in dark alleys, throats slit with blades crafted from repurposed debris. Their commanding officers were next captured, tortured, and left hanging in public places for others to see. And then came the civilians, the humans who had collaborated, the ones who had accepted the Empire's rule. They were being purged. One by one, their homes were set ablaze, their families torn apart. They had no loyalty, no safety. The humans were sending a message. There was no surrender. There was no compromise. There was only vengeance. Zalthar knew then what the High Council had failed to understand. The Empire had not conquered humanity. They had provoked them. And now, humanity was teaching them why that was a mistake. The fires burned high into the night, staining the skies of Earth with thick columns of black smoke. Imperial patrol ships hovered uselessly above the ruined districts, their sensors scanning desperately for targets. There were none. No enemy fleets, no organized rebel factions, no official transmissions declaring resistance. Only silence. And then, the deaths. One by one, Imperial officers vanished from their posts, their bodies later found dangling from the high-rises of Earth's ruined cities. They were stripped of their armor, their weapons stolen, their corpses marked with words written in their own blood. Remember the child. Commander Zalthar clenched his jaw, his 6 fingers tightening into a fist. This was beyond anything he had encountered in his years of service to the Empire. There were no strategic battle lines, no traditional warfare. It was as if the very shadows of Earth had turned against them. Status report, he barked, turning to his command staff. The officers stood in rigid silence, their chitinous bodies tense with barely concealed fear. Finally, one of them stepped forward, a younger lieutenant, his mandibles clicking nervously. "Sir, we've lost communication with outposts 3 through 9. The transmission relays were destroyed simultaneously. We suspect sabotage." Zalthar exhaled sharply. "Survivors?" The lieutenant hesitated. "None, sir." Zalthar's mandibles twitched. "Cause of death?" The officer's hands shook as he handed over the report. Multiple lacerations. Plasma burns. Some were found impaled on rebow. Others were dismembered. He swallowed hard. "Sir, one of the outposts, the entire garrison was locked inside their own barracks and burned alive." Silence fell over the war room. Zalthar's grip on the data slate tightened until the metal casing cracked. This was impossible. The humans had no formal army, no fleet. Their weapons had been confiscated, their leadership dismantled. This was not war. This was something far worse. "This is impossible," one of the officers finally said, as if speaking the words aloud would make them true. "The humans don't have the capability to do this. They don't have the resources." Zalthar's eyes narrowed. "They don't need resources." A bitter silence followed. The humans were fighting with scavenged materials, makeshift weapons, and their own bare hands. They had nothing, and yet they were winning. And they had only just begun. Days passed. The killings continued. Imperial patrols moved in pairs. Then in squads. Then in full battalions. It didn't matter. They disappeared all the same. It was psychological warfare in its purest form. Every night, screams echoed through the city, impossible to pinpoint. Every morning, new bodies were found, stripped, gutted, displayed like trophies. And the worst part, the humans weren't afraid. Even under occupation, even as they watched their cities burn. their expressions never changed. They didn't cower. They didn't beg. They only watched, as if waiting, as if this was only the beginning. And then the Empire made its worst mistake yet. Execute the civilians. The words left High Marshal Ulzari's mandibles with a cold finality, and the officers in the command chamber froze. Even Zalthar hesitated. "Sir," he began, carefully choosing his words, "that may not be wise. The humans are vermin," Ulzari snapped. "They are not soldiers. They are not warriors. They are a pestilence. We will exterminate them as we have exterminated all who dared to resist the Empire." Zalthar clenched his fists. This was a mistake. The humans were not fighting for conquest. They were not even fighting for freedom. They were fighting for vengeance. And nothing was more dangerous than a species with nothing left to lose. The first purge began in the lower districts of Neo-Tokyo. Thousands were rounded up, their hands bound, their bodies lined against the blackened walls of their own homes. Imperial soldiers raised their rifles, prepared to bring swift execution to the human resistance once and for all. Zalthar watched from a distance, his gut twisted in unease. And then, the explosions began. It wasn't from the buildings. It was from beneath. The ground beneath the execution squads collapsed. Hundreds of Imperial soldiers were swallowed by the earth itself, their screams vanishing into the abyss below. Hidden tunnels, carefully crafted, had been rigged with explosives, designed to detonate the moment the Empire moved to commit genocide. The human civilians did not run. They fought. Men, women, even children, armed with nothing but blades, improvised firearms, and sheer rage, descended upon the scattered Imperial forces with terrifying precision. They moved through the chaos like wraiths, their attacks methodical, their rage controlled. They weren't just fighting. They were hunting. Zalthar barely had time to react before the communications feed exploded with overlapping screams. "They are in the vents. My squad's gone. Gone. They are everywhere. We need evac." Static. Zalthar turned sharply to his remaining forces. "Fall back," he roared. "Regroup at the central command post." The windows shattered. Figures in darkened clothing crashed through, their weapons flashing in the dim light. Zalthar barely had time to raise his sidearm before the first soldier went down, a blade slicing clean through his throat. The humans had infiltrated the command post. They had planned everything. Zalthar ducked as an explosion ripped through the room, sending Imperial officers sprawling. He grabbed his rifle, turning to fire. And then he saw her, a child, a human girl, no older than 10, standing amidst the carnage. She held a gun far too large for her small hands, her face streaked with soot and blood, and she was smiling. Zalthar hesitated. That was his mistake. The last thing he saw was the muzzle flash. The Imperial withdrawal was not a tactical retreat. It was a massacre. Entire battalions were wiped out before they could even reach their extraction points. Ships were hijacked, their crews thrown screaming into the void. By the time the fleet finally managed to break orbit, Earth was no longer a conquered world. It was a graveyard, and the humans stood atop the bones, watching, waiting. The war was far from over. It had only just begun. The stars above Earth had never looked so distant. The Imperial fleet, once an unstoppable force, drifted in low orbit like a wounded beast licking its wounds. Smoke curled from the wreckage of shattered warships, remnants of vessels that had been hijacked, sabotaged, or turned against their own kind. Commander Zalthar's breath was shallow, his body aching from the wounds he had barely managed to survive. The last engagement had left his carapace cracked, his right arm still twitching with residual nerve damage. He had barely escaped the slaughter on the surface. Many of his fellow officers had not been so fortunate. He was alive, but only just, and he knew something with a certainty that chilled him to his very core. The Empire had underestimated humanity, and now it was too late. "Commander, the Council is waiting for your report," came the clipped voice of his adjutant, a nervous-looking officer who had miraculously avoided the carnage on the ground. Zalthar exhaled slowly, pushing away his fatigue. He strode toward the central war room, the doors sliding open with a mechanical hiss. Inside, holograms of the High Council flickered into view, tall, regal figures adorned in the elaborate garb of their rank, their expressions unreadable. High Marshal Ulzari's image loomed at the center, his 6 black eyes narrowing. "Commander Zalthar, you will explain yourself. How did this happen?" Zalthar's mandibles twitched. He wanted to snarl, to demand how the council could have been so blind. But he knew better. "Sir," he began, his voice calm but firm, "we did not conquer humanity. We provoked them." Murmurs rippled through the council. Ulzari's gaze darkened. "Explain." Zalthar straightened. "The humans do not fight wars like we do. They do not engage in battles of honor or strategy. They are predators. They wait. They learn. And when they strike, it is not to win a battle. It is to end a war before it begins." Another council member scoffed. "You expect us to believe that a primitive species—" "Primitive," Zalthar cut in, his voice sharp. "We thought them primitive because they lacked interstellar warships, because their weapons were crude compared to ours. But what we failed to realize was that their true weapon is not technology. It is adaptation. They are not a species of soldiers. They are a species of survivors." "Silence." Ulzari's mandibles clicked in irritation. "Then tell me, Commander, if they are so dangerous, how do you propose we handle them?" Zalthar hesitated. The truth was, he had no answer. Because there was no answer, the usual strategies, scorched earth tactics, orbital bombardments, overwhelming firepower, would not work. Humanity did not break under pressure. It hardened. The Empire had tried to tame them. It had tried to control them. And in doing so, it had given them a reason to fight. A reason to hate. And hatred was a fuel more potent than any weapon in the Imperial arsenal. The Sheratork, one of the Empire's remaining dreadnoughts, hovered in low orbit, its hull pockmarked with battle scars. The crew inside worked tirelessly to repair damage sustained during the planetary withdrawal. They did not notice the breach until it was too late. The first alarm went off in the ship's lower decks, a silent, flashing warning that something had entered through the maintenance ports. Security teams were dispatched. They never returned. Then, the lights flickered. A power surge rippled through the ship's core systems, disabling security cameras and locking sections of the dreadnought down at random. By the time the emergency override was activated, the intruders were already inside the command deck. Zalthar barely had time to react before the first shots rang out. Gunfire. Close-quarters combat. Blades flashing in the dim red emergency lighting. He turned, drawing his sidearm, and caught a glimpse of his attackers. Humans, not soldiers, not trained military operatives. Civilians. And yet they moved with terrifying efficiency, as if war was bred into their very bones. Zalthar fired. His shot missed. A figure darted into his blind spot. Then pain exploded in his side as a blade buried itself into his armor. He staggered, his vision blurring, before a boot slammed into his chest and sent him crashing against the control console. He struggled to breathe, his eyes locking onto the one who had struck him down. A woman. Human. Her face was blooded, her clothes torn, but her eyes burned with something Zalthar had seen too many times in the past weeks. Vengeance. She raised her weapon, an Imperial rifle, scavenged from one of his fallen men. "You took our children," she said, her voice hoarse. "Now we take everything from you." Zalthar closed his eyes. A gunshot rang out. The Sheratork never sent a distress signal. Hours later, when Imperial Command finally received word of the dreadnought's silence, a recon team was sent to investigate. They found the ship abandoned. Not destroyed. Not even sabotaged. Just empty. The entire crew, thousands of officers, engineers, and soldiers, was simply gone. The only sign of their fate was a single, blood-stained message carved into the walls of the command deck. "Remember the child." The Empire began its retreat. Not officially, not publicly, but the war machine slowed. Occupied territories were quietly abandoned. Supply chains collapsed. Recruitment efforts faltered. Fear spread. It was not the fear of battle. It was not the fear of war. It was the fear of an enemy that did not fight for conquest, or power, or ideology. Humanity fought for something far stronger, for every family ripped apart, for every child lost, for every crime committed against them. And they would never stop, not until the Empire was ash, not until every last one of them had paid. Zalthar survived. Barely. When he awoke, he was no longer aboard the Sheratork. He was somewhere else, somewhere dark. Underground, perhaps. A human stronghold. He was bound, but he did not struggle. He had seen enough to know resistance was futile. A figure stepped into the dim light. The woman from the dreadnought. She crouched beside him, tilting her head. "You understand now, don't you?" she asked. Zalthar exhaled slowly. "Understand what?" She smiled. "You should have never come here." A pause. Then, she leaned in closer, whispering the words that sent a chill down his exoskeleton. "And you should pray that your people never come back." The lights flickered, and Zalthar knew, in that moment, that the war was lost. The void of space was vast, cold, and merciless. The once mighty fleets of the Galactic Empire drifted in retreat, their forces scattered, their command structure shattered. What had begun as a simple conquest had turned into a nightmare, one from which they could not awaken. Humanity had not fought as a species seeking freedom. They had fought as something older, something primal. Their war was not for territory or diplomacy. It was for vengeance. And vengeance had no mercy. Zalthar had once believed in the supremacy of the Empire. Now, he only believed in one thing: survival. He awoke to the sensation of metal restraints biting into his chitinous wrists, his body aching from untreated wounds. He was alive, barely, but captivity had become his new reality. He did not know how long he had been held in this place. Time had become meaningless in the darkness of the underground facility. The humans did not interrogate him, nor did they torture him. They simply let him wait. And that was worse. Because waiting meant thinking. It meant replaying the horrors he had seen, over and over. It meant remembering the screams of his officers, the silent judgment in the eyes of the civilians who had refused to break. It meant reliving the moment he had understood what humanity truly was. A force that could not be tamed. A nightmare that could not be reasoned with. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. The heavy steel door groaned open, and a figure stepped into the dim light. The woman again. The same one who had taken down the Sheratork. The same one who had stared at him with eyes that burned with something deeper than hatred. She knelt before him, arms resting on her knees as she studied him like one might study an insect trapped in a jar. "We're letting you go." Zalthar blinked. Of all the things he had expected, this was not one of them. "You—" He hesitated, mandibles clicking in confusion. "You're releasing me?" The woman nodded. "You're going to take a message back to your people." Zalthar stared at her, searching for some hidden trap, some ulterior motive. But there was nothing in her face except cold, unwavering certainty. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, blackened object. She tossed it to the ground at his feet. "A data drive. The footage is on there," she said, standing. "Everything your empire has done. Every massacre. Every atrocity. Every child you murdered." Zalthar didn't need to ask what she wanted him to do with it. He already knew. "You want me to show them," he murmured. The woman smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. "No," she said softly. "I want you to warn them." She turned, walking toward the exit. Before she left, she paused at the threshold, glancing back over her shoulder. "Tell them," she said, "that if they ever come back here, if they ever touch another human child." She leaned against the doorway, her expression calm, almost amused. "We won't just stop at your soldiers. We won't stop at your leaders. We'll burn everything. Your ships, your cities, your entire empire." She took a step into the hallway, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Tell them that humanity doesn't forgive." The door slammed shut. The Empire did not formally retreat from Earth. It fled. The official records never admitted to defeat. The bureaucrats and war strategists framed it as a strategic reassessment of priorities, a temporary withdrawal to consolidate resources. But those who had been there, those who had survived, knew the truth. The Galactic Empire had been broken, not by superior firepower, not by advanced tactics, by fear. Fear of the things they had seen. Fear of the things humanity had done. And most of all, fear of what humanity would do if they ever returned. The High Council reviewed the data drive that Zalthar had delivered. They watched the footage. They listened to the cries of children, to the screams of the dying, to the final, haunting message left behind by the survivors of Earth. Remember the child. The Council convened behind closed doors for 6 days. When they emerged, an emergency decree was issued. Earth was to be classified as a forbidden world. No ships would enter its orbit. No trade would be conducted. No soldiers would set foot upon its soil. To speak of the failed invasion was treason. To suggest another was suicide. The name of the human homeworld was stricken from official records, but it lingered in whispers, passed from officer to officer, from soldier to soldier. A ghost story, a nightmare, a warning. Decades passed. The Empire continued. New wars were fought. New species were conquered. But something had changed. A shadow hung over the Empire, an unspoken dread that its rulers dared not acknowledge. Because deep in the void, beyond the reach of their fleets, beyond the edges of their charts, humanity still waited. They had won the war. They had driven the Empire from their world. But they had not forgotten. And one day, they would return the favor. Not as conquerors, not as invaders, but as executioners. The stars would burn. The Empire would fall. And when that day came, there would be no mercy, because humanity never forgives, and it never forgets. Far beyond imperial space, in the darkness of a long-forgotten war zone, a transmission echoed through the void. It was not a declaration of war. It was not a plea for peace. It was a child's voice, crying. And then, silence. The warning had been given. Humanity was coming. And this time, they would not stop.